Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Knowmads Podcast. I'm your co host, Prachi.
And I'm your co host, Bhavya.
Have you ever wondered why do we dream? Are we conscious while we're sleeping? How is our brain able to generate a three-dimensional visual image every night while our eyes are closed? Our guest today, Adriana Alcaraz Sánchez, is a philosopher from the University of Glasgow. In her recent work, she talks about objectless sleep awareness and compares the ideologies of Western philosophers regarding consciousness while one sleeps with various different philosophy traditions around the world. This is an extremely intriguing conversation where Adriana explains some of the interesting concepts of philosophy. Since we recorded this podcast online, the quality of audio may not be the best, but I assure you that the quality of the conversation is immaculate. So, let's go.
Adriana, welcome to the Knowmads Podcast.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
So let's get right into it. You mentioned in your thesis that there is no universally accepted definition of consciousness and its altered states, like dreams. This poses a restriction to making progress in the field, is also something that you mentioned. So my question is twofold. The first part of the question is, why do you think that, in fields like this, a definition is very important? So that's my first question. And my second question is, I can simply go ahead and ask, what is consciousness? But that's like a very heavy question. So the way I'm going to ask that question is, how does one characterize consciousness and altered states like dreams? What is some characteristics of consciousness?
Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of why it's important, well, I guess actually there were three questions there, I would say. So one is in terms of to point out the fact that we don't have unified definition of what consciousness is. The other is why is that important? And then why always problematic, have one, not to have one, and then how we can characterize consciousness. So in terms of what the problem is, that consciousness, how is in a way described in philosophy, is quite different from what is used in psychology or neuroscience, and then it's quite different from what laymen or folks in the street that would characterize what consciousness is. And I can tell you a bit more about that because I was just teaching a course. Well, it was more like a class, an introductory class on mind and consciousness. That was for psychology students at the university, for students that have enrolled for psychology, but they haven't got enough grades to get into university, so they have this kind of level up course that they need to take. And so I was asked to do this class on, that was the title of the class was meant to call, it was called Mind and Consciousness, which already as a philosopher, I was already, that for me was trigger, why you call this mind and consciousness? And I was the same, but it's okay, I understand. We are teaching this for psychologists, no? And already I started this class, which I also did that last year, giving them a spoiler alert. You're talking about consciousness, but I'm not going to be able to tell you what consciousness is. So already, from the very beginning, you're not going to get out of this class by me telling you a definition that you can just write down in your notebook and say, okay, well, later we have an exam or an assignment, this will be the definition that you use, okay? And they were all laughing, and was okay. So the problem is because we use this term in different ways, no? And then just lay people, just normal person. I haven't studied philosophy, psychology, or neuroscience. I don't know about anything about that. When I say I'm conscious, I one way of saying, using that term is for me saying I'm awake. No, I'm not in a coma, or I'm not sleeping. I am conscious. I am aware of that I'm having a conversation here with you guys, no? Or I'm aware of this table, or I'm aware of something, no? But then we also tend to use the term consciousness to refer about our own self-consciousness or self-awareness of myself. I am aware of me being Adriana. I'm aware of me being a PhD student. I know that I am this person in this world, no? A bit more of introspection, or me being aware I have certain thoughts, no? And then I made them as well to the students. When we started the class, I also post like this. We have this app called Mentimeter, so that you get that in the website, and you just send them a link, and then they can type their own answers with the phone. So I asked them, what's consciousness for you? And then it was interesting because it was like around 30 students, and I got like all the definitions there that are all there. No? So like even themselves, they were not agreeing about what consciousness was. No? So like there was a bit of variety about like being me self-aware, me being awake, me being kind of like responsible of my own acts. There was kind of also this kind of like more loaded sense of like free will, no? Or making decisions, or my personality or my identity, no? And there was like all this conglomerate of things, no? And I was like, well, this is a good example, because this is showing that already you as a lay person, not knowledge about the field, that term already means different things. And then when you go into more academic research, in psychology, it's also kind of like used in different ways. So you also tend to read papers in which when they say consciousness, most of the times refers that an organism is alive, an organism is awake, But then sometimes they want to say this more capacity of self-awareness, of self-reflection, and then that's then completely different. And then philosophers have this very kind of like annoying thing sometimes. Well, I would say I think it's highly annoying that we tend to use consciousness to refer of what it is like to be in a certain state, what we call phenomenal consciousness. So it's just like the fact that you are experiencing, that will make you conscious, okay? And that is why we'll relate them with my work. Because that's your definition of what consciousness is. It is just to experience and just to have this feeling something, when you're in a coma, you will be conscious. When you are not aware that you are sitting at a table, you are still conscious, because it is something it is like for you to be in that moment. And then it becomes a bit more tricky, and that is why it's difficult then when you provide these sort of definitions to people that come from different disciplines. It's like, oh, but that's not what it means to be conscious. To be conscious, to be aware, and to have self-reflection about those thoughts. It's like, well, not really. And then the problem here arises in terms of like why we need to have like a common definition is because then when we do research, especially when we're trying to kind of like put together that research and say, okay, as philosophers, as neuroscientists, as psychologists, we're all trying to find out what consciousness is. But then we are actually doing different things. We are not all talking about consciousness in the same way. So then it also gets confusing then in terms of when we read papers or we share research about, okay, but what was exactly what you were doing here? Then you will have psychologists that won't agree with philosophers about what we are doing, and then vice versa. No? So that's kind of like seems to be first what would be the problem of like why we actually need to have this definition, or at least make clear of like when we are talking about what consciousness is, to kind of like start when you talk about your research. Okay, that's how I define consciousness. And in terms of like what would be a definition, again falls into the same. It's like you will have different ways of like how you want to use that term, no? Like whether you would like to use the term just to distinguish a state that makes you not to be asleep or to be in a coma. So you are conscious in as much as you are aware of the world, you are aware of yourself, or you are aware of your thoughts.
Right.
And then you can be a bit more higher order in terms of like you are not just merely conscious, but you are conscious that you're conscious. So you are aware, you have thoughts, you're aware of the thoughts, what the thoughts are about. Or you're aware of like, yeah, I am here having this conversation with you, and I am aware of that. No? Or can just be about more simple things of just being conscious will mean, just to smell a flower and like having that experience, have a feeling, have an emotion, and that will be enough. No? But then I find that, that is why you would like to make clear what you're meaning, what being conscious, and also to distinguish in terms of like, well, why we won't be saying that then other animals are not conscious, because if we are saying that consciousness is just to experience, then this cat I'm looking after, she is conscious, no? And she may not be within the cat is not self-aware of her own thoughts, but she's definitely conscious. And then we have then issues about ethics, animal ethics, and all that. But yeah,
Right.
that was trying to give you like a short answer, but as you saw, I went down the track, so that was like all my
That was great. That was great.
doing that.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
It was great.
But how does how does not having a definition, put some sort of restriction on how the field progresses in a certain direction?
How not having a definition? Yeah, I guess in terms of that, of like when we are. So we want to kind of like have like a collaborative project, no? So let's say that we know as philosophers that we won't kind of like solve the problem of consciousness by ourselves. And we know as neuroscientists that we won't solve the problem of consciousness ourselves. No? And then we want to kind of like have a collaboration between people from different disciplines, no? So then like the fact that we don't have this agreed definition will make these people not to be also even agreeing about what they're actually doing. Because like maybe one part, like neuroscientist is like, well, for me, conscious is to be in a state of arousal. So like what we need to do is to look in which areas of the brain are kind of like responsible for that, no? And then I'm just gonna do this experiment, and we're gonna do we're gonna see which areas of the brain are active, blah blah. Oh, yeah, problem solved, no? But then the philosopher will be like, okay, but what is this actually showing us? This is just showing us which are the areas of the brain that are active when you do X, no? So yeah, I find that the problem kind of like falls into that moment, in the moment in which we're trying to like put together all these disciplines that are kind of like working towards the same kind of like, looking into the same target of research, in this case consciousness, no? But they come from different source of methodologies, of way of working. They have different understandings about what this target phenomenon is. So then it's difficult to see where we're actually doing the same. Where we actually researching the same thing or not.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
So you also talked about pure consciousness from Indian philosophical traditions. Could you give our listeners a brief overview of what pure consciousness entails and how it differs from the Western notion of consciousness?
So that's a very tricky one, and I'm going to try my best. I guess that in the last 4 years, that's what I have been doing for my research. I should know what pure awareness is, or what pure consciousness is. But I think no one knows. That's going to be that was at least the conclusion of the thesis. So pure consciousness, it's the kind of like in Indian philosophical traditions, they use this concept in order to describe what will be the essence of consciousness in it. Okay, so like in a way to say what will be the simplest and more basic way to be conscious. Okay. We could also use this in Western traditions. It's just that it's not used like maybe we kind of like conceptualize like that by saying just consciousness or just consciousness as such. No? But the idea of pure consciousness is a bit more loaded. So like when you look into the literature, so kind of like the idea behind is that these philosophers, what they're trying to find is like, okay, we're trying to see what would be the most minimal state of consciousness, because we're trying to find out what will be just the essence of consciousness. Okay, so trying to find what are the consciousness in its more basic form. Okay. But the problem arises here because they have kind of like certain kind of like metaphysical assumptions about what that is. And then that goes with their own visions about what the world is, what the mind is, what people are. And then it becomes a bit more tricky because it has certain ways in which, so they want to understand pure consciousness in a certain way, okay? So when you read those works, it's quite difficult to see whether what they're talking about is something that they wish it would be. So like kind of like we would like this to be in that way, or they're describing that of like, oh yeah, you kind of like throw kind of like philosophical analysis, conceptual analysis, we have arrived to the conclusion that that's what it is. Okay. But kind of like trying to explain this in more plainly, the idea here is that a state of pure consciousness is a state in which you are just existing.
Right.
You are not conscious of something as such in terms of like everyday life, no? Like me being conscious of a table, me being conscious of a chair, me being conscious of myself or my friend or the person I'm talking with, okay? So all these things are gone. I'm just in a state in which I am existing. I just exist. I just present there, okay? And the way of conceptualizing this is just to say, well, in that state, I'm not aware of anything, like distinct object of awareness. By object, just, again, let's go to very basic things, not table, chairs, computers.
Right.
But then it can then also involve like thoughts or emotions. No? So I'm not aware of having a certain emotion. I'm not aware of having certain thought. I'm just conscious. And there's not even consciousness of me being aware that I am aware. I'm just here. I am just existing. Okay. And I guess that would like an easier way to understand that, even if you may not have experience with meditation, which, to be honest, I don't even have. I'm not like an expert meditator practitioner or anything like that. Or even if I try, I kind of like fail to really get into that sort of a state. But trying to give people the example of like thinking in like in a certain moment in which when you are like kind of like, I don't know, practicing a sport, or you are just like hiking in the mountain, and then you get into this state of like flow or like existing in which there's nothing else in your mind. No, it's just like you are just there, present. And you are conscious, isn't it? Like you are still there, you're alive, you are awake, and you're experiencing things around you, but you just feel them, no? Isn't it? You're not just in a state in which you're actually even thinking about the fact that you are conscious. You are just present, okay? So I think the idea is like reaching a state that is a bit like that, okay? That there is nothing for you to be aware of, even if there are things surrounding you, and then you are like kind of like your brain is processing them, but you are kind of like paying attention to those things, no? And in terms of meditation practices, it goes a bit into the same form, no? It's like the idea of like certain meditation practices is that you start by paying attention to just a mantra, a sound, a word, or your own breathing, no? And then you're supposed to kind of like reach a moment in which even that disappears. So you're just paying attention to that single thing, and you're arriving to a moment in which that thing is not there. It's not the focus of attention anymore. You're just being there. Okay.
Okay.
So the idea of pure awareness is that it's like reaching a state in which you are just conscious, and then you kind of like realize what being consciousness is, without having like what they say, the typical kind of like dual state of awareness. The dual state of awareness for these traditions is to me having the experience of me as a self, no, me, Adriana, having the experience of being in this world, me doing my shopping, me going to work, me typing in the computer, okay? So the idea is that you arrive in the moment in which even that is not present, okay? So I find always it's difficult in terms of like putting as an example, because when you read about those concepts in the literature, kind of like are explained normally with metaphors, with words that maybe like, if you're not really kind of like engaged in those sort of traditions, it's kind of difficult to understand. And then also you don't really have reports, first-person reports of people saying, oh, that was my experience. So in a way, it's also a bit of work of like trying to imagine what it's exactly is what they're trying to convey there and what they mean, no? But yeah, kind of like the idea here is just like if people trying to understand what pure awareness is, or pure consciousness is just like, yeah, very kind of like essential or basic state of awareness or being conscious that will be translating as a state of just being and existing. Doesn't involve like the kind of like ordinary sort of awareness that you have during everyday life, of being aware of the things that you're doing, the things that you're attending to, that all that is not there anymore. But in a way, you're still conscious and you're present, but you are not even conscious of yourself anymore. You're just existing. Yeah.
Right. Can you you mentioned dual awareness. Can you contrast this with non-dual awareness, which exists in traditions and religions like Tibetan Buddhism?
Yeah.
And can you explain this connection between non-dual awareness and objectless sleep consciousness? And you talked about meditative practices around these, so maybe also try to link these.
Yeah, so these traditions, so now I will say, kind of like in a very broad term, we call them contemplative traditions. So our traditions of like philosophical traditions in the East, that they kind of like have a lot of grounding on like meditative practices of like kind of like using that as a way to understand what the mind or consciousness is. Okay. But within those traditions, like we have many of those. No, as you mentioned, like one example would be Tibetan Buddhism. But even within those, we have like also different lineages or different schools. No, so I was trying to make this point of like, we're saying that it's like in a very broad term, no, but then each kind of like lineage or school within Tibetan Buddhism or then different authors will also contradict themselves. No, but kind of like in very broadly terms. The idea here of non-dual awareness is to think about that. No? So like normal awareness is said to be dual because it's characterized by having a subject, who is the person who's having the experience. No? In this case, me, Adriana, I'm having the experience of being here now talking with you. And this sort of experience comes like with a very distinctive feeling of like that I am me, no? I'm having a first person point of view. I am in this kind of like sort of like position, no? So like kind of like the point of origin departs from myself, no? And it's something that's the rest of stuff, no, in the world, no? Mm-hmm. And the issue that kind of like in a broad sense Tibetan Buddhism has is that they think that that's an illusion. They think that that's not what actually consciousness is. Because they think that this idea of like really feeling that you are a person and then you are having this experience of a world, that's it's illusory. Because this person that I characterize as myself, Adriana, doesn't really exist. And then we have this thing that kind of like popularly, like people may refer as kind of like a no self view of the self. So kind of like more broadly, kind of like we normally kind of like say that many authors in Tibetan Buddhist traditions, they kind of like have the idea that the self doesn't exist, okay? But what they mean by that is the thing that doesn't exist is not that I don't exist as a person, or this is fake, okay? That all this is real, and you all exist, I exist, everyone exists. What doesn't exist, or what they think is not actually real, is the fact that there is an experience of a self and another, okay? They think that that's something that is constructed, and it's something that you construct from your own experience, of your way of seeing the world, but it's not something that is showing how actual conscious experience is. They think that what conscious experience is, so connected again with this idea of pure awareness, consciousness in experience is kind of like a whole. It's like kind of like oneness. So you should try to arrive to a state in which you don't distinguish yourself from the other. As I'm saying that, I can realize how contradictory I can be. Okay, but the idea is kind of like trying not to have such a very, very strong idea of like me being separate, as something separate from the rest. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then it's when it goes to then other ideas in Buddhism about suffering, okay? So like they have also their own commitments about why all this happens. So like why we should have like trying to get a state of non-dual awareness is because they think that many of the issues or problems that we may have in our everyday life, they come from this idea of like me being kind of like stuck in this self-other experience, okay? So yeah, I don't want to go much detail of that, but it's just for people to try to understand of like that, I guess, as I was mentioning before, no, they have their own metaphysical commitments and their own kind of like background beliefs in those traditions that brings them to have this vision of the world and their understanding of like what consciousness should be. Okay. So the state of non-dual awareness will be that, no? So the dual awareness one is the normal one, or like we'll say usual one, better say ordinary one of like me, Adriana, being aware of something. And the non-dual one will be the one which like, well, there's no Adriana being aware of something anymore. It's just awareness. Because I don't identify as myself being aware of an object or something that is not me. I kind of like, I become one, or just everything. It's just me being present or being aware, okay?
Right,
so yeah,
right.
So it's just trying to kind of like understand this non-duality by just saying, yeah, as before, trying to arrive in a state in which is pure awareness of like, it's just not me being aware of things, or me being aware of thoughts, or being aware of myself being aware. It's just existing and being present. And that for them will already start becoming as a state of non-duality. You're still there, you still exist, you're still present, no? So like you're still a person, you're still a self. But the non-self kind of like thing comes from not being so attached to this idea of a self, which is distinct of the other. But it's just, everything is just consciousness in a way. So I try my best to make a description of that. And as I say, I find it's quite difficult because it's something that's quite different from how we understand consciousness in our everyday language. It's kind of contradictory. Even when you are trying to put it together, it's like, I know that doesn't sound right, but that's how it works. For this.
Yeah. So the Advaita Vedanta tradition purposes that you were talking about in your research proposes that the existence of deep sleep awareness, or sushupti, where consciousness persists even during deep sleep. So this challenges the Western view of deep sleep as an unconscious state. How do the Advaitins defend the idea of conscious deep sleep? So one of the arguments that I was reading in your research was that they propose that when you wake up from a sleep, you have a memory that you were sleeping, and if you have a memory, which means you were conscious. So can you talk more about this this way of thinking about consciousness even during deep sleep?
Yeah. So the Advaita Vedanta are a school of philosophy within the Vedic tradition, which they follow the Vedas, which is, it's a very, very old text of philosophy, which I don't even can read myself because it's in Sanskrit. So everything I have read about those traditions is based on translation from other authors. So not even myself, I can tell that I can even say that I am a Vedic scholar or anything like that. I think that there's like people more expert than I am out there, no? And that they are the ones that are responsible of translating those texts, and make them available for us. And my understanding of all the research I have been doing is that the idea here is similar to what we were just saying about non-dual awareness and pure awareness for Tibetan Buddhism, for instance. So the Advaita Vedanta have similar ideas, okay? And everything always comes from the same, no? So it's kind of like similar metaphysical commitments of like they don't want to say that it's any moment on your existence that you cease to be conscious, okay? So they have this very real commitment of like, this needs to be always the case. So you always need to be in a state of consciousness, otherwise you, in a way, you cease to exist. Because consciousness is kind of like the most fundamental kind of like part of existence, okay? So again, not trying not to go into kind of like off track again there, but it's like just for people to understand of like, that's kind of like main commitment that these traditions have. Therefore, we need to kind of like develop our views on consciousness based on that, okay? But for them, now, in order to defend that, so as you were saying, so in kind of like more Western traditions or more commonly, we will normally say that, well, if I am sleeping, I'm not conscious. The only moment in which we will accept that I am conscious while I'm sleeping is when I'm dreaming, or I remember that something happened, no? So like I wake up in the morning and, oh, what happened last night? Like, well, I just lost consciousness, and I don't remember anything, no? And even though when you remember a dream, like kind of like we'll say that the normal folk will still not characterize it as consciousness, no? Will say, well, I have dreams, no? And I remember my dreams. And they will describe like their own experiences in the dreams, but as philosophers or psychologists will say, well, that was a conscious experience, no? While you were dreaming, you were having this experience of yourself in this illusory world. Then when you wake up, you realize that was a dream, unless you are lucid dreaming. But yeah, I would say that most people will agree that that's a conscious experience, no? Like something was happening while you were sleeping, namely dreams, or you could have remembered any other sort of experience that maybe was more brief. It doesn't necessarily need to be like a complex dream, okay? But if none of these things were in place, you will say, well, yeah, I just wake up in the morning and I have I had a very good night's sleep, no, because I don't remember anything. Kind of like everything went black, no. I just went to sleep, woke up, like, oh yeah, it has been 8 hours. I don't know what happened. It was just like completely blank in between. No? So we normally tend to say that that's kind of like a deep sleep. No, there was nothing happening. I was unconscious, kind of like nothing at all, a complete blackout. So these traditions are a bit different, and they say, well, as I was mentioning before, that cannot really be the case. First, for all metaphysical commitments of like consciousness cannot cease ever.
Right.
So you need to find a way to justify that. And their argument is like, well, when you wake up in the morning, you say that you have, at least in a kind of like, even in the case in which you say to have this blackout experience, even in those cases, you say, well, I did rest and I kind of like, I had like a peaceful sleep, no? Just taking the case in which you don't remember absolutely no dreams or nothing happening during your sleep, or you were not interrupted throughout your sleep, there was absolutely nothing, but you still remember, you still you still wake up by saying that, by reporting, I have a peaceful sleep. Okay.
Right.
So for these authors, then what they say is like, well, if you wake up, and as you wake up in that moment already, you can associate that experience of sleeping to yourself. That's because there was some sort of consciousness going on there. Because otherwise, how possibly could you attribute that experience, well, that moment, the sleeping moment, to yourself if there was nothing going on, no? Not even this minimal sort of consciousness. Okay. So the idea here is for them is to say, well, in a way, you may have not been conscious as we understand in the lay term, as I mentioned in the beginning, no? Like not conscious in the way of like being awake, being aware, or even being having an experience. But in a way you were existing and you were there. And there was kind of some sort of like a print that moment was leaving you. And this is why when you wake up, you immediately know that was you, okay? So it's a bit different, their sort of explanation in terms of like they are trying to justify why you don't cease to exist. And trying to justify that there's always some, in a very even subliminal form, there's some sort of self-experience, of experience of you existing, even in those moments in which you are not aware of anything happening. Okay.
Right.
So that seems to be something that even many mainstream philosopher would kind of like question. And I can already tell you that mainly kind of like most mainstream philosophers in analytical traditions, they will disagree with that. And they will be like, well, that seems to be kind of like very complicated argument to make. And we don't really need to say that, no? We would still say that you were unconscious, and there's still this like a sort of like connection between the self that went before sleeping and the self that woke up, without having this story about the fact that something was happening during the sleep, okay? So that's one. And that's something that I haven't actually looked that much in my research, or like trying to justify that or disregard that. I have just left that a bit aside. What I have looked more is into what happens if you actually had an experience while you were in sleep that was not a dream, or like fully fledged dream experience, or something a bit less complex than a dream. But there was more of an experience of you existing and being in that moment, no? Like that you wake up and you remember that happening. So let's not think that much about this blackout experience while you were sleeping, but let's think about you waking up and saying, oh, yeah, actually, I didn't have any dream. I had a peaceful sleep, but I remember having something. I may not be able to describe fully what was that, but I remember that I was conscious somehow, okay? So that has been maybe more the one I have been interested with, because that seems to be at least a bit more clear case of like that something was going on there, that even during like deep sleep, there was some form of consciousness that seems to be slightly different from the ordinary sort of consciousness. And then when you look into the literature, then there's like many reports or many descriptions of those states of more like, again, same idea of like the pure awareness stuff, of people
Right.
claiming or reporting that, during sleep, had an experience of pure awareness. I was just merely aware. There was nothing to be aware of. I was just aware. There was no dream as such, or me having thoughts. I was just aware. No? And that then is a bit more different from this blackout, because then you wake up by having the memory of having had that experience. Because the other one of the blackout is like, well, you wake up by remembering nothing. There's nothing that happened. The only thing that you report is just having been peacefully sleeping. This is why that here I need to spell out a bit more this, because I find that when you read kind of like descriptions for the Advaita Vedanta, they normally tend to be conflated, so that there's kind of like different sorts of stuff that they're talking about, no? And sometimes it's about this blackout experience, and it's still them claiming that you are conscious. And then other kind of descriptions is more about like, it's not there was a blackout, it's like that you remember having been conscious, no? And I would say that seems a bit more plausible. The first one, as I say, would be quite contentious and difficult to kind of like go forward with that. The second one of like, well, it seems that if the person wakes up, or I wake up and I remember that something happened, then probably I did have an experience during deep sleep.
So when you say something happened, what do you exactly mean? Like, you just remember that something? Is it an external thing during the sleep? For example, you remember that I could like hear the fan turn on or turn off or something like that. When you say that, when you wake up, all I remember is that, hey, I had a peaceful sleep, and I remember that something happened. Can you sort of illustrate what this something is?
I see. Well, I guess it's something could be anything. So it could either be, as you say, like you being aware of the fan, or you being aware of a noise or something like that. Then there you could then question whether you were sleeping or you were still asleep. If you were then aware of the fan or something external.
Interesting.
But most of the times, this something is more about just a feeling of being present, an emotion of just existing. And then it becomes a more complicated, or more or less complex, no? So you will find reports of like things that are more very, very basic, of like, just a feeling of just being conscious. There's nothingness, other than just being conscious. That people cannot even describe much more than that, no? And then from there, you find reports of things a bit more complex, like, there was an awareness of maybe a sound that was not external, but was like kind of like more internal, or was some kind of like bodily experience.
I see. Okay.
And then it can be then transformed into even things that they seem more like dreams, but are not full-fledged dreams. No, so you have like a kind of a spectrum. So that's why I just say something, right? Because I was trying to already include all this array of things. No, but most of the times we will. The kind of things that they're thinking about these authors is about like the most minimal one of like just existing, just being present, or just being conscious, and not able to describe much more than that.
So, I mean, having read about these arguments on your thesis, and the little amount of research that I've done, I feel myself sort of subscribing towards the Advaita Vedanta sort of notion that it's no matter what, no matter the spectrum, the consciousness just exists. And it won't cease to exist. But anyway, I would like to know, what your viewpoints are about this. On top of that, I want to illustrate something that before we started recording, Prachi mentioned that there's a great podcast, and I'm assuming that you know about this professor. His name is Antonio Zadra. He's from Montreal. He talks about sleep medicine. That's what his research is. And then I was listening to this podcast on Quanta Magazine, and then there's this, like you said, modern philosophers, who use analytical methods to study this, imaging, just looking at different parts of the brain, what's happening during these activities. They sort of tend to, when they talk about these philosophical ideas, they tend to separate the brain and and I, sort of. You mentioned that I am aware that I have a brain, and my brain is sort of aware that there exists an I. So they sort of separate the two, which I think is very conflicting. And I don't understand. And what he mentions is that when you're let's say dreaming, this this I goes away, and then the brain is sort of on autopilot. The brain is doing its thing. So what are your views about this?
That's it. So like maybe you sort of like, well, that's the case. So that's what happens when you're sleeping.
Okay.
Well, I guess so. I mean, in terms of like, I cannot talk that much from the expertise of like what actually would be like, or what would be my endorsement there, or like what would be the best theory that explains about what happens when we are sleeping. But as you say, it's like, in a way, we have like it's a very, very different state than when you have during normally ordinary consciousness, no, like ordinary like life, or like when you're awake, no. So when you're asleep, you're deprived of like most of the external stimuli that you will normally be processing. Although that's something that's also questionable to an extent. So like it's not that you are completely devoid of any kind of like stimuli or like processing of that stimuli. So as you were saying, no? So you could still be asleep, and actually in the EEG or like in the electroencephalogram, we will say that the person is asleep.
Okay.
And the person could still be processing certain lights or light cues or certain noises that are outside. Okay, so we will still say the person is still sleeping, but there is still certain information that is being processed by the brain. Okay, so it's not that you are completely void of those. Like it's not like the brain is like in a state in which it's closing the box completely. No, it's already closing the box most of the time because your brain is inside your skull. But we will say that in normal wakefulness, now there's an interaction with the external world. It's constant, and in the sleep it seems to be less. But it's not completely devoid of that. But
Interesting.
the fact that it's already less, no. So that's then what may create what you're saying that Sadra is mentioning, no, in terms of like, yes, you are in a way having certain experiences that are not triggered by the stimuli or the kind of like stimuli and the processing that the brain is doing of that stimuli, but it's something that is internally generated, as we tend to say. Okay. But then that would be more thinking about dream experiences or like typical dream experiences. And that's normally the question that people have now in terms of like what dreams are. Like, well, yeah, I guess like internally generated experiences that you have. Whether what those means or all that, then that's a different question. But kind of like the idea here, like, yeah, your brain is completely in a very, very different state. Then we also look like through the different sleep stages that are also very different. It's not the same to be in like slow wave sleep, which is like the first phases of sleep as you're falling asleep, no, and when you're going to bed. Then the kind of like more deeper sleep stages, or REM sleep, which is normally the one that's normally characterized by dreaming, no? Which you can also dream in the other ones, but it has also been discovered that it's more fragmented, kind of like a bit less complex. No? So yeah, but you're already thinking about that. You're already thinking that our brain first doesn't stop working when we are asleep, but it also works in a different way. Then we can, of course, think that our brain, that we're going to have different sort of experiences when we are asleep. No? But we can also think that in some cases, those experiences also won't be that different from the ones that we have when we are awake. No? If we think about dreaming, no, like it's not to an extent, it's actually very similar to wakefulness. Like it's actually super similar, no? Like you, when you are dreaming, you think that you are in reality, that you are awake, no? So you get really, really believe that you are in your waking life. And the only difference is the fact that all these things are not generated by external stimuli; it's just internal stimuli. No? I kind of like trying to link that back to the pure awareness stuff and what the objective evidence says is very different, no? Because here we are thinking about kind of like very complex experiences, no? Of like me being immersed in this internally generated world.
Right.
The things that they are thinking about, these authors are thinking about, is the opposite, no? We are thinking about experiences in which that doesn't happen. So there's no kind of like perceptions of things happening, there's no thoughts happening. It's just mere existence. And that seems like completely plausible. But as you were mentioning, is like the thing that I think I will have a problem with, and I think most authors will agree, is that it's what is very contentious to claim is that there is no moment at all whatsoever that during sleep you lose consciousness. And that's what the Advaita Vedanta says, or Tibetan Buddhism says. So it's like, for them, it's like, it's no moment at all in which you lose consciousness. And that seems a bit difficult to digest, but also difficult to see as well, of like, why would it be the case that you always need to be conscious? Like, either then we need to change ever slightly, or even more, what our definition of consciousness is, or there seems to be something wrong of like, yeah, you could still think about a moment which is a blackout experience, but then you will relate that with wakefulness as well. It's like moments in which you just like tune out completely, and then you have a moment of like, oh, I don't know what's going on.
Right.
Could we still say that is losing consciousness completely, or whether that you were then having an experience of pure awareness that you don't remember about, no? So yeah, not sure if that really completely answered you, but I was trying to kind of like spell out all these different things you were saying in your question of like, combined with the idea of like more like how dreams are generated, or like the sort of more mainstream experiences during sleep that we may think about with this other sort of more minimal sort of consciousness, let's say.
Yeah, this is all very interesting. And I mean, before we move forward, I want to know, how did you become interested in the idea of consciousness and dream studies and research about that? How did you become interested in that?
So I guess a bit by, well, I don't know, actually I don't know, because it's something I have been interested always. So I studied psychology during my undergrad.
Okay.
And I chose to study psychology because I still learning. I need to keep going backwards and backwards. No, like in the moment in which I made that decision. I was always fascinated a bit more about like kind of like the actual experience of the world, no, and what that means, of like how it is the fact that I'm having this experience here, like who is explaining me this, no. And then already in high school, by doing biology or doing physics, it was like, well, there was no answer to it, no? So you can learn about, if I was studying biology, no, I couldn't, they teach you about how the body works, no, like that, like the different functions, but they don't really, you never really get an explanation about what conscious experience is, no. And that was kind of something I was very obsessed always as a kid already. I don't know, I was like, for my own experiences and life, I was always like kind of like, fascinated by the fact of like that I am able to wake up in the morning and having this experience of me and the world, no? And then that was paired by the fact that always since I'm a kid, I always remember my dreams a lot, like every night. I guess we all have dreams every night, but not all of us, we remember them. And I remember them actually too much, because that's annoying, because then you wake up and you feel tired, because it's kind of like you remember all these narratives and things that you have been doing, and then you cannot stop them. They're there in your mind. And it's like, shut up, I don't need to remember all these things.
Right.
But then I was kind of like also curious of like, how come I have these experiences where I'm sleeping, of being in this world that feels like it's the actual world, and it's not until I wake up that I realize this is fake. But how come I have these experiences? No, what all this means, how is this generated? And I kind of like started studying psychology for that reason, because I was very, very curious about to understand more about this idea, or like what consciousness is, how do I perceive the world, how kind of like our cognitive functions work, no? And then to understand how, why that makes the fact that then I also dream and I have this very similar experience while I'm sleeping, no? And to understand the difference and all that. But then, spoiler alert, I found out for actually 5 years, because my degree was 5 years. that psychologists don't have an answer to all this. So it was like me every time I enroll into a new year, all the courses and following everything was like, but why is this the class on dreaming? Where's the class on consciousness? Oh, it's still not happening. Well, maybe next year. Maybe it's the more advanced course. And you never get it. It doesn't happen. It was then in the last year when I started inquiring about this to my lecturers, and they were like, "Well, that's because you're a philosopher. We don't do this." I'm like, okay. I thought philosophers were doing something else. No, like had I known, I would have studied philosophy. But well, then I found out that philosophers also don't care about other things that psychologists do. So in a way, I need to study those things too to find a bit more. But yeah, kind of I think my interest has come from that, of like my own experience of like me questioning of what consciousness is, my own experience about with dreams, of like remembering them very well, or like having this very vivid dream experience and wanting to know more about what all this. And then me not finding those answers when I was studying my undergrad, and then being a bit frustrated of like, okay, well, I'm sure there's something else there, so I need to find out. And then I never did, and then I did, well, then I'm going to do my own research so I find out, and then I didn't do either. So then, yeah, I keep trying to do more and more research to see if I ever get the answer. But I think there is no answer, so that's okay. It's about the process. It's not the goal.
Yes.
So, yeah.
That's great.
I mean, in the physics community, there's a lot of debate about, what's at the fundamental level, how does consciousness function, and we have these laws of physics that govern the world around us, and we always try to sort of map these laws onto the way we understand how our brain works, how consciousness works. And there's so many theories out there, like we can get it, we can do a lot of physics talking about consciousness, but it's very important to actually understand how there are already existing schools of thoughts with consciousness. So before even giving it like a physical, because once something is physical, it becomes very hey, these are the laws, these are the equations, and that's how it works. But clearly, when you think about psychology and consciousness, things do not work like that. It's not that simple. There might be an equation that's out there, and someone might find it, but it's not that easy to sort of.
And we will get back to how you were talking about that you always used to remember your dreams. But before that, right now, so you talked about in your thesis the concept of objectless sleep awareness, which you say that it encompasses various conscious experiences during deep sleep that lack ordinary contents of awareness. Could you illustrate what this state of consciousness is like? What do individuals actually experience during objectless sleep awareness, and how does it differ from other sleep states, or let's say wakeful experiences?
So I have been using this term in my research just to encompass, or like kind of like put together in the same category as just mentioning, that you're pulling on from my thesis. So it's just a category to describe like a wide range of sleep experiences that, let's say, don't fall within the ordinary forms of sleep experiences that we all know about, like again, complex or ordinary dreams. Okay. And the term kind of like goes connected to this idea of pure awareness that we were talking about before. It's just that for kind of like the research I have been doing these years, I have found many authors trying to characterize this state as a state of pure awareness. But then the more I have gone into it, it's like I find that it's not a good way to describe it, in terms of like, it's not good to say that it's only a state of pure awareness that you can have during kind of like objectless sleep awareness, but there's like different ways in which you can have objectless sleep awareness. And that's why I proposed kind of like this kind of like name to categorize these sort of experiences. Okay, so the sort of things that I'm thinking about, or the sort of things that kind of like put under that category, are different wide range of experiences, ranging from what we were mentioning before, of like starting with these more basic forms of like just experience of just existing, or just being conscious, or just present, which would be the ones that they are normally referred to by the Advaita Vedanta or Tibetan Buddhism. Okay, so we have these ones, let's say it's like the more stereotypical forms of objectless sleep awareness. But then we will have other things that they can still be objectless, in as much as it appears as being objectless. And by objectless, I'm meaning things that don't seem to be this sort of like dual experience that we were talking about before, no? So they don't appear to you as me, Adriana, being aware of that object. It appears more as me being aware, or just awareness. But then in the sort of like the description or reports that people will tell you about those experiences, they may still be objects of awareness. And that is the contradictory part. And this is why you put them under the same category. But when I'm describing them, I'm just saying, okay, all these are objectless forms of consciousness during sleep, just because appears to you as there is no object. But the one thing is like what appears to you, and the other thing is why it actually is. Okay, so
Right.
when I say why it appears to you, it means like how it looks like. Okay, so for me, when I have this experience, it looks like there was no object, and I was aware of my body feelings, but it did appear as was no object. Or I was aware I like a body, but it did appear as there was no object of awareness because I didn't have a body. Okay. So here let me go again into this other thing I was commenting at the very beginning of the podcast now, like how we use definitions in like the more kind of like common domain, how we use certain terms in philosophy. No? And for philosophy, philosophers are super mega, they are very, very, very super duper picky when they describe things as object things, no? So like a word, like say, for you to be aware of something, there needs to be an object of awareness. And if I'm saying that I was aware of just being aware, that was already an object of awareness, no? Because the object is my own awareness.
Right.
If I say I was aware of an experience that lacked a self, I was aware of an experience that lacked a self. And the experience that lacked a self, that's an object. Okay. So that's a bit of like the kind of like contradiction here of like what like a lay person will tell you and what then kind of like theoretically a philosopher will tell you about it. No, it's like, well, this experience, if like when you pull them apart or when you take these reports, you can identify these objects. Okay, you can identify that these people were aware of an experience in which they were just existing and there was nothing, or there was absence, or there was this kind of like selfless form of existing. And for them, these experiences, they will be objectless, no? Because there's no ordinary forms of object of awareness, no? That was not aware of a table, of a chair, of a computer, of a person, of a thought. But there was an awareness of me being devoid of a body. And I'm saying this example because these are things that I actually found from my research or like actual reports that I took of people describing things like that. One of like kind of like more frequent ones were people describing this experience of being in a void or in a nothingness.
Okay.
And again, as an annoying philosopher, then I will need to tell you of like, oh, well, an experience of the void or nothingness is an experience of something. It's an experience of the void or the nothingness. No? But surely that appears as something that lacks an object, no? Like if I haven't had one of these experiences myself, but I can understand if I have an experience in which there's absolutely nothing, and there's not even me there, or like doesn't have like a very strong sense of self-awareness involved, that seems like an actual experience that is objectless, isn't it? Because there's not absolutely nothing going on other than the nothingness. No? So yeah, kind of like these will be kind of like examples of things that I have taken from my own interviews that I did with participants, of like them describing things of like, yeah, awareness of being a void or being in the blackness, or being in a state in which I was devoid of like bodily awareness, so I lack a body or had a body that lacked any sort of form. I had an experience in which I was not really there, but I had an experience. No, there was no self as such, but I know it was my experience. No? So it's kind of sort of things that I find that is more in terms of like what is the language as well that these people are using, because it's just extremely difficult to describe something, how that experience will be, and to put that into words, no? Because if it's actually an experience like a self, how else are you gonna describe an experience like a self? But it's your experience, no? But yeah, so these are kind of things that I put under the banner of objectless sleep awareness. But we will have a range of those, no? We'll have like the ones in which it's just me existing, me being alive, yes, or actually not even me, it's just existing or just being alive. Then you have things that's a bit more like, it's awareness of the nothingness, awareness of the void. And then it can go into things more like, there was awareness of the void and me floating, or awareness that there was light, okay? And then it becomes a bit more resembled maybe to a dream experience without having this sort of like very complex imagery, no? That has a bit more elements, no? So difficulty always here is like, okay, which one is the one then the Advaita Vedanta or the Tibetan Buddhism traditions are talking about, and it's not always that clear. And that's why I put them all under the same classification to say, okay, it's a category that of like, it's a range of different sort of experiences, no? We can call them objectless, no? But we need to be clear that there's like there are different ones within this banner or umbrella term, no? And some of them will be closer to this pure awareness state, some of others it's a bit more contentious where they actually are.
So you mentioned, briefly mentioned how you studied about these things. So it's a very natural course for us to understand how studies in this subject is conducted. You mentioned that most of the studies are anecdotal, and the traditional way is for someone said something about it is very third person.
Yeah.
What you mentioned is that you emphasize the importance of first person methodologies for scientific studies of conscious experiences. So could you contrast between these two ways of analyzing consciousness and dreams, and how what's your sharp methodology, and how you did your research?
That's it. Okay. So actually, but now that you're saying that, I think there's more like 3 different forms that you can go about, no? So like one is like the completely, let's say, more objectual form that will be, just to rely on anecdotal reports, no? So like someone say something, someone that was from someone else, that I found somewhere else, say something, and I'm using that report of that most of the times it's just like kind of like second, even third hand description of an event, no? So let's say that, kind of like, let's imagine an example of the real world, no? Like someone saw, kind of like witness an accident happening, no? And then you don't really get that report of like the person describing, I saw this crash with the red car and the blue car, and this happened. I was there in the corner with this street. No, kind of like, it's not really this sort of like first person experience, but it's more of like, journalists that interview that person, and then there's the newspaper that interview the other journalist. So stays there, no? But also we will say about anecdotal reports can also be like, just like someone who report that thing, but it's just very brief account about what that experience was. But then we will have what normally kind of like more scientific approaches to consciousness do, or like more kind of like mainstream approaches, like both from philosophy and more psychological and neuroscientific research do. So neuroscientific research or psychological research to study consciousness, they're trying to be as objective as they can. And they think that the best way to kind of like characterize conscious experience is not that much about asking people directly about their experiences, but to conduct some sort of experiment that is kind of like manipulating certain aspects of that experience, and then asking people to execute a certain task. Okay. So let's say we are kind of like examining what will be the reaction time by you pressing a button and what is your reaction time by seeing certain images on the screen. No? So you take longer time, that means that was taking longer time for you to process that information. And then we can play around those behavioral facts. And by, I don't know, let's say it's a study that is kind of like seeing how long it takes you to visualize a picture of a dead body. I don't know why this came to my mind, but that's the first thing that came to my mind. I kind of like, yes, yeah. I just kind of was thinking about, experiments on kind of like emotional reactions, or like things of like how that will interfere with your reaction time. Okay. But then we are not really asking people about their own experiences, isn't it? What we are looking is like, we are then looking the behavioral data, no? And then from there, we are calculating how a manipulation of a certain variable, in this case, the reaction time, the variable will be the image that I'm showing you, and then the outcome will be the reaction time. So we are saying, how affecting this variable will have like an outcome, or will have an effect, will affect that behavior. No? And then from there, we do our own kind of like theories about like, this is due for you having more, kind of like emotional background for you seeing this image of the dead body. I don't know. But then you may ask, kind of like, again, in an anecdotal way, as these participants about their experience. So you, as an experimenter, then you may ask them at the end of the study, just to fill in a questionnaire, or to fill in some questions or something about what happened during those. No. And then when you start a bit more to ask them about their actual experiences, because the other thing was just observing their behavior, but you are not asking them about, what was it like for you to see this image of this dead body? So when I talk in my work about first-person approaches to consciousness, my critique is that most of the work that has, kind of like more traditional working on consciousness is done from this more objective perspective, no? Of like, we are trying to see which areas of the brain are active. We are trying to see what are your behavior when you do X, or what happens X, okay? But we are not really asking that much people about, okay, but what, if I'm presenting you an image of an apple, what is actually the experience that you're having, no? Like, tell me a bit more about what actually you're seeing. And for certain things like that we may study in psychology, it may make sense to do the more behavioral approach, isn't it? There's certain things that are like, okay, we usually want to kind of like compute the different reaction times between people from that are educated on these issues from people who are not. So it may make sense to only have a study that kind of like examines reaction times. No? But for topics like, if you want to understand more how these people were actually perceiving the image of an apple, behavioral data is not going to tell you that much, isn't it? It's not really going to give you much insights about what was it like exactly for you to see that, or to have that experience. Or thinking about other sort of studies of more kind of like, there's also this area called experimental philosophy that are like quite interested and to kind of like understand a bit more why people do certain decisions. So let's say these typical trolley problems, which I kind of like imagine many people have heard about. So it's this kind of hypothetical scenario in which people are presented with a case of like, there's this town that has these two tracks. No, some person has fallen in one of the tracks, and then there's another track that's going directly to the town, and we need to divert the train. Like, the train will either kill one person and save the town, or will go directly to the town and kill everyone. No? And then you ask people, like, what would you do? No? And in a more experimental way, they have trying to run the same sort of experiments, more like in the experimental lab, by seeing what's going on in the brain, no? Like, what was the areas of the brain that were active, and what was the difference there between the people who were giving an answer to just kill everyone in the town or kill only one person. So again, there seems to be kind of like a good enough examination to kind of like understanding a bit more how people will react or will answer to see different scenarios. But if you really want to know a bit more, what would be the experience of like, let's imagine someone who actually need to be there, who is behind those, like changing the tracks of the train. No? What was going on in your mind? What made you to make that decision? No? Like, or like to select one over the other. So then that wouldn't be enough by just taking this more observational or second-hand data. No, you really need to have like to ask them more questions. Here I'm just saying examples that comes from the top of my head of like things that have actually been done in research. But when we think about consciousness, as I was mentioning, I think things change completely. No? So we want to know what consciousness is, and we want to know more about what is your experience of something. I find that the best way is to first ask people about what was that experience exactly. And I'm not neglecting the other facts. I'm not neglecting that we also need to conduct neuroscientific research, and we also need to see what's going on in the brain, or to also gather this more behavioral data, of course. No? But something that has been kind of like overlooked in research is to ask people more about their actual experience. No? Even when we conduct more experimental research of like having people in the brain scan and to see, kind of like examine what were their experiences of perceiving a certain object, the sort of like studies that they're carrying on are always based on behavioral data. We are asking participants to do something. We are not asking participants about what was going on. And that seems kind of very crucial when we look on conscious experience. Like if we don't have that part of the data, we also don't have information about what was going on when you were undertaking this experiment. We are missing a big part. So yeah, now I realize that I have again gone a bit off track, but I hope that was what you were asking about. Like, what was the difference between both?
That was great.
So let's talk about lucid dreaming now, which is often described as a state in which one becomes aware that they're dreaming while still in the dream. So can you elaborate on the different ways lucidity is understood in the literature of dreaming, and maybe also shed some light on different types of lucidity, such as cognitive, attentional, and emotional?
So here I want to try not to be the annoying philosopher at the beginning. I will try to do the easy answer and then be the annoying philosopher after, especially because I wrote a paper on that. So then, it's, even for myself, I think it's an actual annoying answer. No, kind of like the general idea of having a lucid dream is what you are saying. No? So it's like normally when you are dreaming, you are not aware that that's a dream. So you take the dream to be your waking experience, and then when you wake up, nature is like, oh, actually all this was not true. Why I was anxious in this dream? Why I was running? This is not what, I'm not awake. No, like I didn't need to run. I was fine. Nothing was gonna happen. This is not gonna affect my reality, my real world. No. So kind of like in a more kind of like widely sense, when kind of researchers talk about lucid dreaming, they talk about this sort of dreams in which then that doesn't happen. I don't take the dream to be reality. I'm in the dream and then I say, oh, actually this is a dream. And that's it. That's kind of like main definition that most sleep researchers or researchers will agree upon. And problem kind of like arises when then most cases when they think about lucid dreams, they think about the ones that you can also manipulate or take control over. Okay, so many people, when they become aware that they're dreaming, they also are able to do cool stuff, like the movie Inception, and they are able to say, okay, well, I realize I'm dreaming right now, no? And why would I like to be here stuck in my office? Oh, I'm gonna fly, or I'm just gonna go to this other island and never visit. I'm just gonna picture that in my head, no, and I just go there, or I just know I meet someone that I like, or I just do cool stuff. No? So then, kind of like in a way, also then happens that again, people from main audience or people who don't have experience or they don't have background in sleep research, they also tend to conceptualize lucid dreaming as such, no? Like that's the movie Inception, no? Lucid dreaming is all those dreams in which I realize I'm dreaming and then I can do cool stuff, or I can change the scenery, or I can change the plot and take control over it, okay? But then from research, we know that that's not really the case. It's like that would be, there's people who can actually do that. And apparently you can do that with practice. I can tell from experience that I cannot do that. Or maybe I haven't tried hard enough. I have had lucid dreams, but not to that extent of like actually being able to change or do whatever I want. But from what I heard of other people and what from my research, there's many people who are able to do that, and they apparently there's actually books and training that you can take, and people say that after taking that training or kind of like the more that they have, more lucid dreams that they have, they're actually able to take control over. Okay, but that seems to be in a way. So even if there's many people who are able to do that and that can be trained, that seems to be still the minority. Majority of times when in the sleep research dream research, they ask people about whether they were lucid or whether they were aware that they were dreaming while they were dreaming. People are even confused about that. They don't really know where they are, because most of the times it's more about this more fleeting feeling of like, oh well, yeah, I knew this was a dream, good, and then you just continue with the dream. And most of the times will still be that of like, it's very kind of like, in a way, very kind of like subliminal feeling of like, this is not really okay, or that this could be a dream, but there's still the dream plot going on. There's still in a way, the dream is controlling you, you're still like trapped there. You're not able to wake up, but you also not even think about that anymore. You still in a way take this to be wakeful experience, okay? So it's not really that strong. So there seems to be then a bit of a disagreement in the literature about how to describe lucid dreams, but especially from a more kind of like practical point of view, because then if you want to ask participants in a study whether they were lucid, there seems to be a problem there, because most people won't even be able to answer because they don't seem to know what that means. Because they're like, well, if that means to be aware I was dreaming, yes. Was I aware? Was I able to do much with that? No. But to what extent I was even aware? Like maybe I had this fleeting thought that was a dream, but then disappeared, and then everything continued as normal. Or maybe in a way I knew there was something that it was not correct, or I knew there was something off with my dream, but I didn't know what was that. So this is why then this kind of like, in a way, this conversation about lucid dreaming kind of like went more into the philosophy realm. So like mainly it started first with more kind of like dream or sleep researchers, or like trying to see what that meant exactly. But then philosophers, as I was saying, we are annoying, and we want to kind of like spell out the differences between a concept, and then it's not exactly then what you want to say, because you don't want to only take into account those people that they are controlling the dreams, because that won't be the minority of people. But then if you include those ones in which there's only a fleeting thought that you are dreaming but nothing else, then that doesn't seem to be right either, no? So all that ends that there's not really then this agreement, there's not agreement about what will characterize an actual, just minimally lucid dream, no? So like the one in which you cannot control everything, but also the one in which you are just aware that you are dreaming, no? Because as a description, that seems to work fine. As you just saying, lucid dream is that in which I am aware that I'm dreaming as I'm dreaming. But what that entails, like why do I need to be? What do I need to be aware of? Do I need to be aware that this is a dream, and I need to understand the consequences of that? Do I need to understand what dreaming is? Do I need to kind of remember my waking life? So there's kind of like a lot of issues there, no? And then from what you were asking me, so that's
so maybe just talk about the different types of lucidity.
So coming back to that, then it's certain philosophers, they have trying to distinguish what we could call more like pre-lucid dreaming. So it would be dreams that kind of like lead to you to eventually become lucid, no? So it's something in between, no? So the ones in which you realize there is something wrong with what's happening, no? So I don't know, let's say you're dreaming and then suddenly an elephant enters your room. It's like, that cannot be right. Elephants are not meant to be here. But you still don't have this kind of like aha moment of like, oh, this is because this is a dream. So there's certain things in the dream happening that is kind of like make you realize, no, that cannot be happening, or there's something wrong here, no? And that's why
the attentional lucidity or the cognition lucidity?
that I will say is attentional one.
Right.
Although in my paper I have a problem with that definition as well. But yeah, because so these are two philosophers that they wrote about this definition of like different sorts of lucid dreaming, and they were distinguishing what they call attentional lucid dreaming, which for them is the sort of lucid dreams in which these things happening, no? So there's something from the dream that brings you to later realize that that's not a dream. But it's not completely clear for the description whether that is an actual lucid dream. And that's kind of like my critique here, and that's why I put those under the umbrella term of pre-lucid. No? So there seems to be dreams in which they lead you to have then eventually the experience of like realizing that that's dreaming, that's a dream, but not necessarily. No? Or it could be that in some of those you do realize in a kind of like more unconscious way. And here I'm using something, kind of trying to introduce a terminology for like common people, but any philosopher will be here attacking me of like, why are you saying this is unconscious when it's conscious? But like that, I'm just meaning of like, well, kind of like in a way, I think I like to say subliminal, because I think that's most what philosophers will understand better. But just to say, kind of like, you are not consciously aware of that, so you're not really reflecting on that fact. But in a way, you know that that's a dream. You know that that's a dream and that you're dreaming. There's nothing that you can do, nothing that you can control. You don't really have this passing thought that says this is a dream. Okay. But in a dream, in a way, your behavior or your way of perceiving things are kind of like run by the fact that you are dreaming. Okay. So that will also fall within this attentional lucidity that we were mentioning, because it's in the way in which these authors talk about it. So that's the issue here, that sometimes this attentional lucidity may be this more subliminal way of like knowing that you're dreaming, or it could be this kind of like pre-lucidity, like there's something in the dream that kind of like that tells you there's something wrong, but you don't really end up having this thought that you are dreaming. So this is why it's not clear. It's kind of like, in terms of your actual experience as a dreamer, probably you won't see a difference. This is more in terms of like theoretical level, as annoying philosophers of like, saying, well, in one, this will be happening, and the other one, this other thing will happen. But one would make the cut for one to be a lucid dream and one to be the other. The non-lucid dream is where you are aware of or not that you are dreaming. But remember, from what I told you at the very beginning, of like the way in which we describe consciousness as philosophers. Okay, so for you to be aware of something doesn't mean that you need to be consciously aware. So you don't need to have a thought that says in your head, I am dreaming right now. You can be in a dream in which you don't have that thought of I am dreaming right now, yet still know that is a dream. And that is when then, as non-philosophers, we are like, okay, where was that then? Is that even possible? No? But yeah, it is possible, no? Because you can still be conscious. You can still have that experience. It's just that you don't have this concept in your head of like, this is a dream. There's no message, in your mind that appears. It's just like, you know where you're perceiving things as a dream, but you don't have the thought form in your head saying this is a dream. Okay. So that would be slightly different varieties of lucid dreaming. And this is why, in terms of actual experiments or research, it's much more complicated of like how you ask people about those things, because if you only refine lucid dreaming as those in which the person is completely aware and consciously aware of something, like, oh, I was dreaming, I know this is a dream, that is easy for them to tell you whether yes or no that happened. But if we are looking into things like, oh, wow, but did you perceive the dream in an unconscious way, that was a dream? They will be like, well, I don't know, sure. No? So that's why I was saying that I was going to tell you first the easy answer and then go into more like the nitty gritty of philosophy of like, well, that is not correct, because they have all this more convoluted way of like understanding what being aware means, what knowledge of me being aware means, and that is more, again, it's more conceptual, theoretical thing, but not that easy to pinpoint when you have that experience, let's say.
A very interesting question that comes to my mind is, even though this is emerging out of an internal stimuli, and you're having like a very immersive experience. It always seems that there's some conflict with this dream world and your logical way of thinking, because I mean, you've already mentioned that the thinking and all of that is sort of suppressed, even though you're still conscious. But an example that you mentioned with an elephant being in the room is very similar to, so I've heard this, that for example, a lucid dreamer is flying, and then suddenly the person becomes aware that, hey, humans don't fly, and then you suddenly start falling towards the ground, that hey, this seems illogical. So there always seems this conflict of logic. So my question is why that is, and the second, sort of closely related to how you test these things, is there a way to understand if these subjects are basically, are they lying sometimes? Are they just making up stories, or is it like, do you have ways to test these experiences?
Yes. So in terms of the first question, I don't really know how to answer that in terms of like why. So what brings you sometimes to have this sort of lucid dream experience in which you realize the lack of logic of it, and that kind of like stops you from doing what you were doing, no? Like in the case of flying, like you're flying and then you realize, oh, fuck, I am actually dreaming, and that's not what happens with, like, by the laws of physics, I cannot fly. Why would that make you stop, no? Here I will pull a very kind of like, psychological answer of like, well, that maybe then it's like, well, your fear interfering, no? Like, it's like you were meant to do something in the dream, but then you doubting about it is like, well, that's what prevents you from doing it. But again, I'm just really improvising that. I don't really know what would that be the case of like, but it seems, it is a funny thing of like why, even like just the fact of like why, if you realize that you're dreaming, most lucid dreams, why you won't be able to control them, no? Because I remember even myself, like most of the ones I have, and I seem to have this very recurring lucid dream. Well, it's not the same kind of dream, but it's like I always have this kind of, it's a similar thing. I always, when I become lucid, for some reason, I'm driving, and then I want to drive the car wherever I want, but then I am unable to do so. Like there's some kind of like invisible force that is preventing me from doing that, no? And I always pick up like, oh, this was very difficult. No, I was there behind the wheel, and then I couldn't turn the wheel wherever I wanted. I couldn't. It was very difficult. Yet I was fully aware. I was really knowing that this was a dream, yet I couldn't do that. And it seems a bit silly, no? Because like if you know that that's not real and you are able to realize that, why wouldn't you be able to change the events of the dreams, no? Because in wakefulness, no, when you imagine something, I can imagine now, I know, red flower. Now I can turn this flower green, even if, I don't know, well, maybe the example of the flower is silly because I guess the flowers can be green. But going back to the elephant, I can imagine a purple elephant. No, and purple elephants, they don't exist. No? But I can still do that.
Right.
That's still kind of like product of my imagination. So it's like that doesn't change. No? So why in the lucid dream that will be the case? Why I cannot do things that are not physically possible in the real world?
Interesting.
And then the second one was about like how do we test that? So in most cases we cannot test. We cannot really know whether people are lying. And then we have this problem with most things in unconsciousness research. No, like when we ask people about their experiences and we ask them, we gather first-person reports. We just need to trust those reports. No? The only thing that kind of like in a way can tell us where these people are lying or not, it's just like the circumstances in which that is happening, the actual content of the report, isn't it? But then here we are, as researchers, we shouldn't, as we were mentioning before about the anecdotal reports, no? We are not just going to do a generalization of like just make up a theory for one single report, no? But we have 100 reports of the similar thing, we will be like, well, it seems that people tend to have these sort of experiences, no? Why would be 100 people lying, no? So it seems to be a recurrent pattern here, so maybe there's something going on. In the case of dreaming, lucid dreaming, it's interesting because it allows you in the more extreme cases. When I say extreme cases, I'm thinking of the lucid dream in which you are able to control and change the events, the course of the events. Or even if you don't change the course of events, at least you are able to even control your body, or you're able to actually take part of like the actual physical body, okay? And what I mean is that one of the kind of like sorts of experiments that in a way prove lucid dreaming are the ones in which you can ask participants in real time to do something. So for instance, one of the most popular ones, or one of the first ones that were conducted, was to ask people when they were dreaming, when they were sleeping and they dream and they realize that they're dreaming, so they become lucid in the dream, to kind of execute a certain pattern with the eyes. So normally they are asked to look left, right, okay? And they ask this because the eyes is one of the few parts of your body that you can move when you're in REM sleep. And also because it's quite easy to see in the electroencephalogram because you see a very distinctive pattern there. You can also ask people to clench their fist, and I think there's other ones they can also chew, or certain movements that you can do that will also be detectable, but normally the eye movement is the easier one to see. No? So then the idea here is that if you ask someone whenever you realize that you are lucid in a dream, do this eye movement, okay? Then we will see this in the electroencephalogram. And it seems to be quite peculiar, no? Because then you are kind of like seeing real time. You as an experimenter, no, in the sleep lab, you're seeing that as the person is sleeping, and then you see the eye pattern, and then you go and you wake them up and you ask them, what was going on just before I woke you up? Like, oh yeah, I was having this dream in which blah blah was happening, and then I noticed that I was dreaming, and I remember I need to do this that you asked me before. And then you see both. No, you have both. You have the report of the person telling you what they did, and then you have the actual objective data of the eye movement. No? So it would be very kind of difficult to say of like, well, that was a coincidence. No, the person just happened to report this, and at the same time you happen to get this eye signal. No, like, well, maybe once, but not twice, not 3 times, or not many participants that do the same. No? Yeah.
Yeah.
But then, as I was mentioning, it's a very extreme case. Not everyone will be able to do this pattern. Also seems quite difficult. And then some people also sometimes report of like, I did this eye pattern, but then I was not lucid. Then you wake them up and they say, well, yeah, I was doing this in my dream, but not necessarily I knew that I was dreaming, or not necessarily I remembered this task. I just happened to do that. No? But yeah, it's more really what you were telling me before, like how you test that. Like, that you will only kind of like one of the experiments that you can do is this one, but will only apply for cases of like people who can control the dream, or they can actually control their body. And and as well cases in which you have access to an electroencephalogram and a sleep lab, and then you can have the person under all these all these conditions. No, so yeah, you take normal reports from people, you won't be able to have all this information. But yeah, so it's still a tricky one. But lucid dreaming seems to be still the kind of like the de facto phenomenon for study dreams, because then you can at least manipulate a bit. It's likely experimentally, and see what happens.
Very interesting. And could you also briefly talk about what lucid dreamless sleep is? Because that caught our attention.
So that's a funny term that some authors came out with some years ago. So as this paper called "Is Consciousness This Ever Disappears During Deep Sleep?" And then, well, actually, it was a bit back to that. So it was Evan Thompson, as a kind of like quite famous philosopher. He's actually more a Buddhist scholar than I am, so he actually has done a lot of research on what all authors in the Vedanta tradition and in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition say. And then he came up with this term to describe this sort of like experience we were talking about before, about pure awareness. But then he kind of like wanted to refer to an experience of pure awareness that you are aware of, no? So like it's like as you are having this experience of pure awareness during sleep, you are in a way able to be aware that that is happening. So in a way, we are talking about the same sort of phenomenon that we have been talking through the podcast, no? So like we are talking about an experience that happens during sleep, in which I am just conscious, I'm just present, I'm just aware. There's nothing to be aware of. And the other thing, the only thing that happens is just the fact that I am aware of it, no?
Right.
But then that was connected to the idea of non-duality, because for the notion of when Thompson he puts this coins this term of lucid dreamless sleep, he's not thinking of a sort of experience in which again I am me myself Adriana aware that this is happening. No? It's something that, as he calls it, it happens in a pre-reflective level. So pre-reflective level means that I am not reflectively aware, I'm not consciously aware, I'm not having a thought of like this is happening to me and this is happening right now, to say, oh, I have a thought and then I am aware of that thought. It's a thought that's happening and I'm just aware of it, but I'm not reflecting upon it. Or it cannot even be doesn't need to be like a form, kind of like conceptually formed thought. It can just be something, again, coming back to this subliminal notion I keep saying, because I find it's a way of like putting this notion together for someone who doesn't have background in philosophy that may understand. No? So something that's happening, something that's there, and then when you wake up, you remember that happened. No?
Right.
But it was not the sort of experience of me being aware that I am Adriana and I'm having a lucid dreamless sleep experience. No? It's more of like I'm having an experience of just existing, just being, and just being aware. Okay. So the question here is like, how that is similar or is the same as this pure awareness. For Thompson it is, or at least it's an idea of like he wants to put this terminology to say this is the sort of pure awareness experience that these philosophers are talking about. But then he also wants to say, by using the term lucid to talk about this dreamless sleep experience. By dreamless here, just to make clear for the audience, we are just talking about an experience that is no dream experience. So the dreamless here is just saying, yes, a sleep experience or conscious experience that happened during sleep that is not a dream. Okay, it may be something else, but it's not a dream. And you are lucid in terms that you are aware of that experience. And then he relates that with lucid dreaming, because he says, well, like in the same way that when you are lucid dreaming, you are aware that you are dreaming. When you are in lucid dreamless sleep, you are aware that you are conscious.
Oh, okay.
But you are aware that you're conscious, not that you are aware that you are dreaming, because there's not a dream. But it's not that you are aware that it is not an experience of consciousness, let's say, you are just aware that you're conscious in a way. But then you are aware that you're conscious in this very minimal, pure awareness stuff that we were talking about. No, you're just aware. You're just aware that you exist. There's just consciousness. There's no objects. No. So going back to this term of objectless sleep awareness is the same. No, it's just like I'm just having this experience. There's nothing to be aware of other than the fact that I'm just aware, and there's no actual fully formed thoughts or perception or cognition or anything going on. Okay. Kind of like in my work, what I have been doing is to kind of examine this kind of like notion of lucid dreamless sleep. And I keep saying always, I have a problem with it. But just because the how misleading it could be is more in terms of like the fact that we just call this lucid and we relate with lucid dreaming, then can give the impression that we are talking about the same sort of experience, but actually we are not. No, like one is like a fully formed, fully fledged dream in which I am aware that I am dreaming. The other is just a kind of like very basic, minimal experience of just consciousness. And the lucidity part comes from the fact that as that is happening, you are aware of it. No, it's not this blackout experience we were talking about before of like me going to sleep, blackout, waking up. Oh, I slept peacefully, but no, there's something happening. I wake up and I remember there was something happening. No. And that would be that's what that was is the lucid part added to. And again, as I keep saying, philosophers, we are annoying, and then we have problems with certain terminology just because the fact that then it can refer to other things that are in the literature. So we are like very technical and very like, oh well, if that can lead to some misleading situation, better not to use this term. We should use something that can be completely crystal clear. No? And then here's the problem I have with it. Is like, well, yeah, we're not talking about lucid dreaming. We're talking about something completely different. So let's not call it lucid because that's going to lead to confusion.
Interesting. So there's one thing about lucid dreaming that confuses me a lot. So if we talk about regular dreaming, like our eyes are closed and we're dreaming, and sometimes we remember, sometimes we don't. But we know that the motor cortex that controls our motor movements, the limbic system, and the amygdala that explains why we have emotions in our dreams are all activated during our regular dreaming. However, our prefrontal cortex that helps in judgment, planning, and critical thinking, that is deactivated. And if that's true, how are some people able to lucid dream? Is our prefrontal cortex also activated when some people are able to lucid dream?
So now that you're saying that, I remember there's many papers on the topic of like where I think it's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DPLFC, that what is like what is deactivated or sometimes can be activated, and whether it's kind of like contentious debate here of like whether that is what will make the difference for you to be then lucid or not. But then now from the top of my head, kind of like have these notions here in my head, but like, yeah, we need to kind of like find you out what was the actual debate of like where that actually has been proved, that whether that is related to the lucid dreaming experience or not. That I cannot tell you that correctly now. But I guess that will only make sense, no? Like you think that the prefrontal cortex, which mainly is associated by kind of like the capacity of kind of like forming rational decisions, no? Or like it's also kind of related with personality or like what kind of like characterizes you.
That's right.
Where you think that those should be playing a role for you to realize that you are dreaming, no? Like whether like even if those were deactivated, you could still realize that. But there seems to be some research of like trying to manipulate that as well. So like there's some research that has been done of like trying to kind of stimulate like directly in the cortex certain areas of the brain, especially on the prefrontal cortex. And then this like again anecdotal research. No? So it's like a very famous paper of like in which there were kind of very few participants. They applying electromagnetic stimulation in the cortex in those areas of the brain, and then they found out that, oh, well, that seems to like lead to for them to have lucid dreams. No? But there were very few participants. There was also unclear to what extent these people were actually more or less lucid. No? So then it's still there. The question of like whether that actually is what makes one to become lucid instead of like just remaining non-lucid in a dream. So this is why I couldn't answer you here of like, well, whether there's really an agreement of like that these are the areas responsible of that. I guess it's still the kind of like coming back to the definition of what lucid dreaming is, not like whether we want to say that for me to be lucid, I need to really have this experience of me realizing that I am having a dream, being able to control or like take more ownership of the plot of the dream, or where I can only have this fleeting realization of me realizing there is something odd going to with my experience. And that's always going to be the key for this kind of research, because like even if we were to kind of like apply different electrical stimulation, different part of the brain, is like we still need to get the reports. No, it's like, okay, how do we conclude that these people were lucid or not if we still don't have clear details of what that would be? No? Because if we are only looking to the ones that are like super controllers, let's say, the people who can control the dreams and everything, well, it seems that then we're only looking for which areas of the brain are those responsible for people to control their dreams. No? So yeah, kind of like going back to your question, I don't know how to answer, like whether this will be the areas that are responsible, or why in some cases some people may be able to realize and some others not. But for the sort of like kind of like if you look more of like the sort of training, let's say, of like you find the lucid dreamer community and the sort of like training that they seem to follow to have more lucid dreams. One of the methods that seem to be more popular and kind of like lead to better results is kind of like question during wakefulness, where you are dreaming or not, kind of like have what they call reality checks. And then to pair that with waking up at the specific moments of your sleep. So normally tends to be during the second REM phases. So let's say if you go to sleep at 11 p.m., then kind of like waking up at 3 a.m. And kind of like that seems to be, so like they call this technique like coming, kind of like waking up, like becoming lucid from sleep, no? So from wakefulness. So it's so you will wake up at 3 a.m. and then go back to bed, no? And then you will try to become lucid directly, no? So as you are falling asleep, just like go directly to having an experience, and that is a lucid dream, okay? And there seems to be this, I remember a couple of papers of like looking into which of these methods was kind of like more effective to have lucid dreams. And it seems to be one of the ones that helps people the most. But I guess it needs to be a combination of like you waking up at this particular time of your sleep, and pair that with kind of like more cognitive training, or like you during your wakefulness already been reflecting about where this is reality or not. For in a way kind of like trying to bring that to the dream world as well, no? Like that if you are reflecting, if you are constantly asking yourself whether you are dreaming or not, the hopes is that when you are dreaming, you're also asking yourself that. So then that kind of like enhances this kind of like ability of like reflecting about your actual experience. But there needs to be something as well about your brain or about the sleep that needs to happen. But yeah, those techniques seem to work, then yeah, I don't know, then we will need to have specific areas of the brain to be the ones that are more active. Like, I don't think these people are changing their prefrontal cortex just by doing this sort of training. No? But well, yeah, we will need to have more studies to see that, whether like with a control group and the non-control group, and see which one.
Yeah. Another thing that you were talking about just a few questions ago, that you used to have recurrent dreams. So this is a question that in fact a lot of people are, wondering about, that why do people, have recurrent dreams? And then another question that comes as a follow-up is that, is there a notion of healthy dreaming? Like how
Healthy dreaming.
can like if one needs to find out if their heart is working properly, often doctors say that if you're doing regular exercises and if you find yourself to breathe heavily even if you're just walking down the stairs, that means something's wrong with you, you're not healthy.
Okay.
So is there a notion of healthy dreaming that individuals who are not aware how dreams work should be able to find out themselves, that if what they're dreaming, like some people have nightmares, for example,
Yeah.
and often have recurrent nightmares and keep having nightmares, and some people never dream. So is there a particular way that people should be dreaming, or if that's not happening, something's wrong with you?
I guess there would be, well, the answer will depend on like what you think dreams are, of like why they happen. And leaving aside Freud, which we are not going to talk about Freud, because that becomes a different focus. No, but it's kind of like no one actually subscribes to Freudian psychoanalytic theories anymore, even though like in the mainstream people likes to talk about those, but like in research, like maybe like
Yeah.
very, very minority will even dare to mention Freud. But kind of like the more mainstream view in terms of like what dreams, what the content of the dreams are, is what it's called the continuity hypothesis, which is just to say that what we dream about what we worry about during wakefulness, no? So like the sort of things that we experience during wakefulness, that will be the sort of things that happen during the dreams, no? But then sure, you need a bit more of explanation of like to refer to those dreams in which weird stuff happens, no? But that also seems to be the kind of like more mainstream assumption, once again, of like the people thinking that what we mostly dream about are kind of like the elephants in the room, where actually most of our dreams are like, if you look into research that looks into the content of dreams, of dream reports, majority of dreams tend to be boring, so be what they call mundane dreams, no? So the things that people dream about are boring stuff. Me going to work, me meeting with my friend, or me meeting people or doing things that I worry about during wakefulness, no? So like, of course, these things may be slightly different from the things that you do during wakefulness, no? But the kind of dreams that are you doing supernatural stuff, or that it has this element of bizarreness, that seems to actually be the minority. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, it does happen. But also, you also tend to remember them more, isn't it? Like kind of like the things that are weird, like you're gonna remember them for a longer time, no? Like you can still think of like this dream that you had 2 weeks ago in which this thing happened. Oh no, now I remember the dream I had last night because I was telling my partner we had 2 guinea pigs, and one of them died at the beginning of the year. And then I tend to have these dreams in which then the 2 of them are still alive, no? And I was having this dream in which I was telling my partner, because the one of the guinea pigs, the one that was now it's dead, was back to life. But in the dream, that was the story of like he was back to life, like Frankenstein. And then I was telling him like look, this is why we were meant to keep this all the stuff, no? Because now he's back, he's alive again. And sure, that's not something that can happen in reality, you know, like animals that are dead, they don't come back to life, no? But here it's quite easy to say, you know, like, well, there's my own worries or fears about what happened, no? So yeah, kind of like putting here an example of something that's like, yeah, it can be supernatural, no? But there's also like kind of like connects to my own worries or my own concerns during wakefulness. But also will be some kind of dream that, since it's quite bizarre, it's something I'm gonna remember for quite a long. Because now on the same dream, I remember all the dreams I had, like with the guinea pigs as well. And there were some also supernatural elements that were happening, and some things that I dreamt months ago and I still remember. No? So I was saying all that. So I was saying all that because in terms of like, yeah, that we tend to see to kind of like get very co-opt on those weird dreams, no? And then this is why we also find dreams interesting, and we want to kind of give an explanation of why they happen and all that, no? But actually the majority of them are mundane things, and this is why a kind of like, yeah, mainstream view would be that what you dream about are things from your everyday life. And then that will also make sense if we think about nightmares or why people have recurrent nightmares, and we will find a very strong correlation with people having post-traumatic syndrome disorder and having more nightmares. No? So like, sure, you have had this traumatic event that happened, and then you have more nightmares. The nightmares doesn't need to be about the exact event. No, it can be about something else that worries you, or something that you even know that worries you. No? So yeah, it's kind of like here talking about that of like what I think is the mainstream theory. What the one I also think is the one that kind of like I will subscribe to. But then within those, I can also tell you this a bit more distinction between different dream theories. No. But then coming back to what you were asking of like whether it's a healthy way to sleep, where there's something that we can take from the content of the dreams, I will say no. In terms of like, I don't think dreams tell us much more than what normal therapy can tell you. In terms of like, well, you can examine those and you can examine what the content of those dreams that you have means, but in the same way in which you can examine the thoughts that you have during wakefulness mean. No? So like you may be worried about what to do in the future with your life. You may have a conflict with your partner or with a friend, and then you bring that to therapy. No? And the same as with the dream, you can also kind of like put the dream into the table, no? And then examine that by relating it to the main concerns you have in your own life. No? But yeah, so I don't think there's like a way, kind of like easy way to classify dreams to say, oh, well, like, yeah, like if you are dreaming all this stuff, there's something wrong with you. You must go to the therapist because there's something bad going on with you. Like, I don't think that, but I think that it's true that if like you're having recurrent dreams or your dreams are worrying you, then sure, maybe it would be a good idea you go to therapy, because it seems that there's something that's worrying you about your mental life, no? But just like in a very generalistic way of like, yeah, maybe it would be convenient for you to talk that with someone, but not because it's actually something wrong with you that needs to be fixed. No? But yeah, in terms of like, yeah, we want to use the language of healthy or unhealthy dreams, will be more of like, yeah, I think they can be useful, or they can be a source for doing internal work of like you taking them as either inspiration for thinking about your more wakeful experience, and then taking them as a source of like, okay, can they help me if I'm now having certain internal conflict, or can I use that in therapy or like in a more informal way with a friend, talk about that, or like me myself like doing some journaling and kind of like reflecting on why I'm dreaming about that. I think it's true that it can be a good source for that, but yeah, I wouldn't like to fall into the traps of like these kind of books, Jungian books of like, oh, you dream about the fact that your teeth are falling. That means that something bad is gonna happen to you, or I don't know, because you have a conflict with your mom. It's like, no, like that's bullshit. But I do think that yeah, we also shouldn't just ignore them completely. Of like, it's true they can be a source of like the same as your waking thoughts. They can be a thought for introspection and for examination, no? But in like a more nuanced way of like trying to then relate them to your own experiences and concerns, but not to look into a dictionary of dreams and see what that means. Yeah, don't do that, people. You're listening to that. Don't go buy one of these dictionaries.
All right. So, lastly, I want to talk about the future of the field. So, what are some cutting-edge frontiers of research that's happening in the field of consciousness and altered states of consciousness, like dreams? And some of the projects that you are, willing to work with. What's happening in the field?
Oh, that's a very difficult question in terms of, I think there's a lot happening. And what is happening that I'm concerned about? No, that also is another question, because I think there's a lot going on. There's still a lot of unanswered questions. And when you go to kind of like more mainstream conferences, so like scientific study of consciousness research, and kind of like conferences of the type in which people from different disciplines participate in. So I'm trying to see those as like the ones like that they may answer your question, no? Like not Because if you look about like what philosophers care about or what neuroscientists care about, they may be different. No? But if you look into kind of like wide range of like different people from different disciplines studying consciousness, what they care about. I think kind of like the main things that you find out there is like one is to maybe be more connected to with your field of physics. So it's like what is the mind-body problem? So it's like what is the connection with mind and matter, and like why can be given a like full explanation about how the brain gives place to conscious experience. And then there's still like kind of like high debate about like whether it's enough for us to find the neural correlates of consciousness. By the neural correlates of consciousness, we mean which are the kind of like functions of the brain or areas of the brain that are responsible for certain aspects of consciousness. No? For some people, the kind of like the solution to the problem of consciousness is like, well, we just find every single thing that the brain does. We will have solved what consciousness is, no? Because we will know specifically which areas are responsible of what, and that will be enough. And then other people says, well, that doesn't seem to be enough. No, there seems to be this, and there's still one aspect that won't be captured by just going to physical to physics. And that seems to be kind of like the main contentious debate now in the area of like, okay, which sort of like models or like theories of consciousness give us a full picture of what conscious experience is. There is some of them, some that are more popular than others, but all of them seems to have their own problems. No? So every year you find papers on those issues of like, okay, which account of consciousness seems to be the best, which are the flaws, and which are the things that still need to be solved. And in terms of like more kind of altered states of consciousness, like dreaming, it's a bit of the same in terms of like trying to find maybe an account that can give a full explanation about what dreams are, from both for a more functional perspective, now about which are areas of the brain that are responsible for that, but then a more psychological perspective as well of which are the what makes dreams to be dreams, no? Like what are dreams, what is the content of the dreams, and what we dream about these things. And in terms of my own research and where I'm moving forward, I think I was in between both disciplines, no, psychology and philosophy, and I think there's still a lot to do, and I always get stuck in the actual experience, no? So I want to know more what it is for people to have these sort of experiences, what is for people to actually dream, what it is to have these different sort of sleep experiences we have been talking about. But I also want to know a bit more about how that relates to waking experiences, no? So it seems that the research in sleep and dreaming has been kind of like dichotomized, no? So there's been a lot of like, oh, let's study dream experiences or sleep experiences, and then on the other side, let's study wakefulness experiences. And this has been kind of like this mainstream approach of like to see them as very different, no? As we were talking as well before about like a sleeping brain very different from the wakefulness brain.
That's
but
right.
Now there's more and more research of like the showing that actually it's not that different, and then that you can actually have what is called local sleep, which is to when you are awake, the certain areas of the brain that are activated in a similar way as they are when you're sleeping. Okay. So then it's not that the whole brain is sleeping at the same time. It could be that your certain areas of the brain are sleeping while you are technically awake. No? And then affects as well the kind of experience that you have, the behavior that you have, and all that. So that seems interesting because then kind of like in a way it's kind of like blurring a bit more these dichotomies between sleep and wakefulness, no? And then also shows you that there's like a range of experiences that you can have in both states. No? But in the way in which it seems quite clear that dreams are like wakeful experiences, or they do resemble wakefulness experiences a lot. I think it's quite controversial to claim the opposite, no? That the wakeful experiences are like dreams, or that you can be dreaming while you're awake. No? You can be daydreaming. Right. No, it seems to be uncontroversial, and seems to be something that we all experience. When my mind is wandering, no, and goes somewhere else, and I start imagining all those things while I'm working. I should be actually studying what I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner later. Yeah, but then kind of like can become more complex, no? And it can become into this sort of experience that may resemble the dreams a bit more. No? So yeah, what I find now interesting is this connection between both, no, and what how studying this sort of experience can help us to understand more the sleep experiences and vice versa. No? But also the whole array of other altered states of consciousness, no, like things, experiences you may have during meditation. I haven't personally looked that much doing my research on psychedelic experiences, but it's kind of like they're getting a lot of popularity nowadays, in both kind of like neuroscientific research, but also in philosophy, you know. And they also seem to be interesting for that because they also kind of like trigger a similar state. They could be like more dreamy state, but also this sort of pure awareness stuff that we're mentioning. It's also similar reports to when ingestion of certain drugs. So yeah, it seems that there's so much more work that needs to be done there, and there needs to be a more of comparison between all these experiences, what it actually is to be in those states, and what will be more like that kind of like following research that it's stuck with the distinguishing them. It's like trying to see, okay, what makes them similar, no? Maybe there's more similarities that we think that there are, and that can also help us a bit more to then understand what consciousness is. Yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you for illuminating us with your extremely interesting research, and thank you for
so
your time.
much. Hopefully you found it very interesting as well.
We did.
Thank you so much.